I'd like to introduce our panel of esteemed experts here today. The first speaker will be Richard Honey, who is a barrister in the field of public and environmental law, specialising in judicial review and other such similar statutory challenges, infrastructure projects, compulsory purchase and compensation, climate change and ESG litigation. Richard appears most frequently in the Administrative and Planning Court in the Upper Land Tribunal. He has experience in advising on litigating environmental social governance disputes, including climate change, emissions trading, biodiversity, business and human rights. Rachel McCoy, who is the Head of Commercial and Contracts at the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. Rachel is a specialist planning solicitor with significant experience in all areas of planning, regeneration and local government law, dealing with large-scale strategic schemes, estate regeneration, capital delivery and infrastructure projects. She is currently a director, deputy vice president and national expert for planning, highways and environmental law for lawyers in local government and a Law Society academic board member. Stephen Sorrell is known as a national expert in public sector climate change, energy efficiency and renewable energy. He started his career as an in-house solicitor in local government and went on to be a partner with Eversheds and head up its local government services. He was lead director on climate change in renewable energy in Cornwall Council and then set up his own consultancy. He now specialises in the creation of a low carbon economy through carbon emissions reductions in renewable or clean energy projects. And finally, we have James Lupton, who is a partner from DWF. James is a projects and infrastructure specialist with expertise in advising public and private sector organisations in procurement, major infrastructure projects and public law. His extensive experience advising on a number of market-leading infrastructure projects in waste, housing, schools, police, highways, health, pensions and the nuclear sector focuses on delivering long-term solutions which promote mutually beneficial relationships and commercial results. So I'm going to hand over now to Richard, who's going to open the presentation and he's going to talk to you by providing an overview of the powers available and not available to local authorities to deal with climate change.
Yes, I've been asked to give an overview of the powers that are available to local authorities to help tackle climate change. And of course, that covers mitigation, adaptation and finance. In order to discuss the powers that are available, we need to be aware, of course, of the kind of things that local authorities might be in a position to do in relation to tackling climate change. You may have heard, for example, the Committee on Climate Change advised at the end of last year in its advice on the 6th carbon budget that local authorities have powers or influence over roughly a third of emissions in their local areas. So local authorities are clearly in a position to do a significant amount in relation to climate change. So there are some things that are obvious. It's possible, for example, within what local authorities do normally, to do it in a way that helps address climate change, and waste collection and disposal is an example of that. Then there are a number of things that they could do in addition to their core functions, for example, and I'll go on to mention some of those. And then, of course, local authorities are also in a position of power in relation to what they permit or license others to do. And that covers planning, building control, transport and highways, for example. And those are all critical areas as far as climate change mitigation and indeed adaptation is concerned. And you'll be hearing from the other speakers giving some good examples of how local authorities can use powers to tackle climate change. And I'm not going to repeat the topics they'll be covering, but what more could local authorities be doing, for example? Well, some of it is in relation to local authorities' position as landowners. Local authorities own, I think, about 4% of the land in England, over a quarter of which is county farmland, for example. Local authorities, I think, have 44 farms, and there's plenty of advice, including from the Committee on Climate Change, about how to go about low carbon farming methods, soil conservation, bioenergy production, as well as advice, for example, on things like water storage on farm as part of adaptation. Local authorities have interests in airports. Local authorities own airports in whole or in part, and of course they can be managed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more rapidly. And then there's all sorts of land that local authorities own, all sorts of open spaces, cemeteries and the like, where action could be taken, planting trees, enhancing biodiversity, for example. Local authorities are often transport authorities or involved in passenger transport executives and have power over public transport improvements as well as facilities for walking and cycling. And it's important not only to think about climate change mitigation, but also adaptation. Some of you may have seen the independent assessment of UK climate risk published yesterday, and that identifies, for example, risks to transport networks from slope and embankment failure, risks to transport from high and low temperatures, risks to bridges from flooding and erosion, and they include suggested actions, for example, for resurfacing existing roads, changing materials that are used in new road works. And these are all core areas of local authority functions. Other examples spring to mind, things like how local authorities manage parking charges or taxi licensing policies to try to encourage electric vehicle use. Some local authorities are in charge of managing the effects of coastal erosion under the Coast Protection Act 1949. Others have local flood risk management functions. Work in relation to emergency planning, for example, is obviously relevant to managing the risks of climate change. Local authorities will own buildings, including some housing, and work can be done on decarbonising the existing building stock, retrofitting energy efficiency measures, and indeed managing the risk of overheating in the future. Local authorities also, for example, make many procurement decisions. They buy vehicles and energy supplies and the like, and it's perfectly possible to use greenhouse gas emissions as a factor in the procurement process and giving appropriate, probably more weighting than historically has been the case to those kind of elements in specifications and award criteria. And yesterday's independent assessment of UK climate risk also identifies other areas that local authorities are going to face risks in. So there's risks to health and social care delivery, risks to the provision of education services, for example. Then moving beyond mitigation and adaptation towards finance, local authorities have investments and pensions and can consider climate impact when deciding where to invest and decide to divest from carbon intensive investments, for example. So overall, the key point is almost all local authority powers can be used to help tackle climate change in some way. And it seems to me that it's wrong to think of it as a kind of niche area that needs specific powers or even a particular use of a general power. What seems to me to be needed is for local authorities to use their existing statutory powers to do things differently and to do more than they're doing at the moment. Simply taking climate change, greenhouse gas emissions into account in almost everything that local authorities do. You can set policy objectives to try to tackle climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. You can give climate change factors more weight in decisions, for example, when weighing up competing factors. So it really does, I think, when it comes to asking what powers are available, require an approach to thinking about what local authorities do and can do, which integrates climate change into everything. There are, of course, some particular powers we should mention. There are some specific powers, not many perhaps, but an example was the Planning and Energy Act from 2008. That was, I think, a backbench bill that sought to make it clear that local plans could set requirements for energy use, put into statute, as it were, I think what was known at the time as the Merton Rule. As far as general powers are concerned, we've got the wellbeing power in the 2000 Local Government Act, for example. It may be difficult in some cases to fit climate change into the requirement to promote the well-being of a local authority's area, given the, as it were, global context. But there are environmental issues like air quality, flooding, biodiversity that would have an impact as far as well-being of local areas is concerned. There's also the general power of competence we've got in Section 1 of the 2011 Localism Act, at least as far as England is concerned, where local authorities have got power to do anything that individuals can do. And then there's the normal range of statutory and implied powers to do things which are incidental or subsidiary. So, you've got powers to manage open space and other local authority owned land. It seems to me that if you've not got them as express powers, it would definitely cover as incidental or subsidiary powers, planting trees on local authority owned land, for example, as part of tackling climate change. So the question that I was asked to cover, what are the powers available to local authorities to help tackle climate change? It seems to me that the answer to that question is almost all of them.
So, Rachel, over to you to talk to us about how you can use the planning system to combat climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, as well. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So I think I had a slide on the context there. I'm going to be talking about using the planning system to combat climate change. I think I'll take it as read that we all know where we are on reaching the carbon reduction targets nationally. So I'm going to skip that slide. So I'm just going to talk about the London perspective, really, because that is my world, where I practice. So where are we presently? So at the moment in London, 26 boroughs and the Mayor of London have now passed the climate emergency, and the majority have adopted a target to get to zero carbon. And some boroughs have also adopted emission reduction levels of borough-wide, and obviously there, as I say, the Mayor has a net zero target to reach by 2050. I just wanted to touch upon the London Council's perspective, if I may, because overlaying all of the individual efforts that authorities are making, London Councils is the forum whereby that's kind of the pan-London approach to combating climate change. And what happened back in December 2019 is the committee there got together and then issued a joint statement, and then within that developed 7 actions, and these are all about formulating a common approach to data collection and to the formulating action plans, overall coordination. That all makes sense and is a good practice, the way to go. So within that there are 7 actions, and I'm going to just talk about the low carbon development action and building the green economy. The reason I'm going to talk about those 2 specifically is because each borough has been, well, not each, there are lead boroughs that are leading on specific elements of this work, and one being on the low carbon is Hackney and Tower Hamlets. And as of last week, I was still head of commercial and contracts there, been there for a couple of years, but as of this week, what difference a day makes, or a couple of days, I am now in the Hounslow stream. So I'm heading up governance and the legal side there. And we are leading on building the green economy. So that's how all of that ties in. So just touching then upon the low carbon development plan, so that work stream as part of the local council's work. So it's all about, you know, formulating a plan to work on getting the carbon emissions down, and it's it does all different things, this work stream, but it's also about formulating guidance, which, as I've said, there is focus specific and integrated on all different elements. So some of it is about, you know, guidance on planning and building regulations and site inspections delivery, as it says there. Some specific guidance for listed buildings, conservation areas, etc. And then, you know, also good practice, examples of good practice, the promotion, as I said there, of adopting low carbon standards by developers, and model schemes to visit, accreditation, and, you know, providing good examples of those schemes where they're winning. So, you know, we want to promote that as far as we can. And then just touching a bit on the Hounslow green recovery, because that's focusing on that element. I mean, it's fair to say in both boroughs, the CO2 emissions are very high. That's some of the highest in London. In Tower Hamlets, obviously, because we've got the Blackwall Tunnel, and then we've got, you know, the A12, you know, carousing right through the borough. So the air quality levels are really bad. And in Hounslow, aviation central because of Heathrow, not so much now, but, you know, we're getting back there. And, you know, it's kind of juxtaposition, isn't it? You want it to improve, but you don't want the air quality to get even worse. But yes, so on that journey, there's all different interesting things that we are looking at in Hounslow and prioritising, which are set out there in 4 pillars. On the planning side, I suppose the low carbon neighbourhoods is the focus there, and a really interesting concept of these 15-minute neighbourhoods that 15 minutes. So there's that, and there's lots of retrofitting of buildings and things like that, as you'd expect. A big focus on our green spaces and improvements there. And then there's also this work stream on green aviation, working with Heathrow and trying to kind of, you know, get into that space a bit more and be collaborative working and find some more green solutions. So watch this space there. So just going into, so that's the kind of overlay for London councils, but just going into a bit more of the granular on the ground borough approach to planning. So in Tower Hamlets, you know, the plan is to achieve a net zero target, focusing on various areas that it says there, renewable technologies, and, you know, looking at emissions and buildings, waste and procurement, like what Richard touched upon there. In terms of buildings, you know, we've adopted a local plan policies that facilitate that. Also undertaking a review of council assets for zero carbon proposals, transitioning to, you know, different technologies, LED lighting, and there's been some real good reduction on tonnage there that is on the side. Also reviewing design standards as well, with those objectives in mind. So the other element, which I won't talk too much about, is power as well, because that's another whole stream that, you know, the council has been purchasing renewable energy, electricity, also looking at the decarbonisation of CHP, again, there commenced solar PV analysis and looking at retrofitting for biosolo technologies, things like that. And then also continuing with the delivery of carbon reduction programs, which have been really successful in schools. And, you know, I've put there that the savings, you know, the wins that we've had there. And also rolling out to SMEs and residential heating efficiency projects. And again, the LED lighting, that's you know, something that can be done quite, you know, it's not rocket science to do, but it's something very, very effective within our arsenal, within local government. And then transport, I won't talk too long about this, but again, weaving in everything through our transport strategy as well, because all these things run in tandem and together, you know, it builds, you know, strong framework. And then the Livable Streets programme, which, you know, for everyone in local government practice have been very, very exciting times with all the challenges and Bishopsgate following that, and very controversial, low emission neighbourhoods and so forth. But, you know, it does reduce emissions, but yeah, it's just it's a hot potato at the moment, isn't it? Okay, so I just wanted to then just touch upon how it kind of works, like a bit more in terms of the planning agreements and how we kind of capture it there. So our current policy in Tower Hamlets, as it says there, it requires the emissions to be achieved for a minimum 45% reduction, you know, on site, and then the remainder, you know, through in lieu cash contributions where that cannot be achieved. And that's how we, you know, secure that carbon offsetting element of it. And it says there, I've put down kind of the threshold for that, which is residential development of 10 units or more, or a combined, you know, gross floor space of more than 1,000 meters, and all major non-residential development. And also where a site can't facilitate the reductions required on site, and that's, you know, that's a planning judgment there, then we will seek a contribution, and we do, and we seek quite large contributions as well. Also on our own new council developments as well, there's like the standard there, which I think lots of authorities are doing as well to achieve net carbon standards, and just ensuring that our buildings are designed to respond to future climate needs, and they're sustainable, and, you know, they fit the new carbon landscape, so they don't require retrofitting in the future.
Thank you. So we are now going to hand over to Stephen Sorrell, who will talk to you about, Stephen will be talking about using the local authority estate for microgeneration. Over to you, Stephen.
Lovely, thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to join you today to talk about this. I've been a solicitor for 39 years now. I've done all my career in local government, either working in-house or working for local authorities from the private sector. But I spend most of my time now actually as a consultant working further up the supply chain. And the reason I did that was a lot of the legal work I did on projects, by the time the project got to me as the lawyer, my first question is, why have you structured it like this? It could be done in a better way. And for that very reason, I decided to move up the food chain a bit. So I spend most of my time now working with local authorities, actually shaping projects, looking at what's possible, doing the concept and helping the whole thing through the local authority process. And that includes solar PV, wind, biomass, hydropower, even wave and tidal. But I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years advising on climate emergency declarations, what they mean, how you construe them, and how you put together a viable action plan, which is the real key to it, I think. But I've been asked today to look at the local authority estate for renewable energy projects. I'm not actually going to limit myself to microgeneration in actual fact. And time restrictions mean I've only got a small amount of time to focus on this. So I'm going to look at 3 areas: local authority solar farms on local authority land, solar PV on buildings, and solar PV on social housing. And the reason I've chosen solar is that's where most of the activity is actually going on. It is the easiest of the technologies to undertake, and most local authorities across the country are looking at one project or another. Wind has planning issues, AD and other technologies have other issues in relation to them. So solar is really where most of the action is. But let's start with a bit of context. None of this, of course, is done in a vacuum. As a strategic advisor, you'd expect me to start, wouldn't you, by saying the process would normally be a strategic approach. And that normally means the declaration of the climate emergency. And as we've heard in the introduction, that normally means you set some targets. There's two aspects to a climate emergency declaration. The first one is in relation to you and your own estate, your own functions, your own carbon footprint. The second is the wider area in which the local authority exists, and different declarations make different pledges in relation to those, which is why it's necessary to construe them properly, of course. You then have the council's carbon footprint baseline needs to be sorted out. So you've got an evidence base to show where you're starting from in terms of where you're trying to get to. You need a viable action plan in support of that. So any declaration to be of any value has to be underpinned by an action plan, which effectively says, here's where we are, here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there. And there's some weaknesses in relation to that across local government, I think. And then also, you have to clarify how much emissions will be reduced by activities such as swapping to EVs from ordinary fleet cars and vehicles, and then what needs to be offset. And there's all sorts of rules about offsetting, which I might mention if I get time. And finally, you need a monitoring and reporting regime. So that's the sort of strategic context, if you like, in which all of this goes through. So let's look at solar farms then as the first one. And I think these are ideal for local authorities for a variety of reasons, but the two obvious ones are, firstly, they have access to inexpensive capital, principally through the Public Works Loans Board, but other avenues as well. And they also tend to own large tracts of land. And Richard mentioned the county farms estate, for example. When I was director of climate change in Cornwall Council, Cornwall itself had over 40 county farms. I'm just doing a job at the moment for Staffordshire County Council, which has over 40 county farms itself. And I did a project for Warwickshire County Council, which had that many small holdings. So lots of land is actually owned. And there's two ways to do this. The first is the developer route, and the second is the investor route. I'm not really going to say anything about the latter. That's when you go and buy a solar farm that's already been built, perfectly possible in terms of powers. But the reason that 99.9% of authorities have gone for the developer route is because that keeps all of the value of the project within the corporate envelope of the local authority. And what that means is a local authority comes up with a scheme, it looks at its land, it procures help to develop it, and then it owns and operates a project over at least a 25-year period. And there are benefits for that, both financial and non-financial. It's not just all about money, of course, although that tends to be what drives the members, in my experience. But the non-financial areas might be community leadership, leading by example, carbon benefits, energy security, and of course, jobs and growth into the local economy, which are the lifeblood of economic development. But on the financial side, there are also very good gains to be made, and of course these are tax-free. So you would expect a reasonably sized solar farm to make an IRR, a return of around 5 to 10%. And some local authorities have recognised that a solar farm project actually can be a sausage machine that turns capital into revenue. And local authorities are capital rich through the sources I mentioned, but revenue poor. So that's really quite useful for them. How would it go then? As I said, you develop the concept, you get consultants in like me to look at your land or buildings or whatever it is and say, yes, you've got a project here. You go to members for a decision, they set a budget, you then start working on it. Planning consent and grid connection are the two deal breakers. They're the things that you'd look at first in doing this, but then there's other areas of preparation too. When you've prepared all of that side and all your ducks are in a row, you go out for a procurement exercise to find a contractor who will build and operate the site for you. The site's built, constructed and commissioned, and then you have a contract for the operation and maintenance of it. And there's lots of examples of this. I was involved in the very first one in the UK in Cornwall Council, because I was the director down there at the time. I was the architect of that one. That was followed in Telford and Wrekin by a 5 megawatt solar farm, which they developed. I was a principal consultant on that. And also in Wrexham in North Wales, where they developed a 3 megawatt solar farm. But there's still not that many of them. There's about 12 to 14, I think, in the UK, and we're surprised that more haven't actually come forward. The returns that you make, by the way, depends on what happens to the power, and I'll come back to that in a moment or two. Let's press on to buildings then. Buildings is a very similar sort of scenario, I suppose. Again, local authorities own lots of buildings, town halls, offices, depots, all sorts of other things. And the business case in relation to buildings is very strong indeed. And the reason for that is that most local authorities are paying at least 10 or 12 pence a kilowatt hour for their electricity. And effectively, you can save that if you have solar panels on the roof and you're using the electricity in the building. And there's lots of examples of where local authorities have actually done that. The process is very similar. Again, you get the concept, you get the consultants in to look at and work up a proposal for you. The issues here are slightly different. There's quite extensive permitted development rules that mean planning application may not be required. And you may not need a grid connection either if it's 100% self-consumption on site. So it's definitely a little easier in that regard. But buildings-based solar is slightly more expensive than land-based solar. So there's swings and roundabouts in relation to that. My best example of that would be a leisure centre. If you can put 250, 300 kilowatts of solar or even more on a leisure centre roof, that's a building that's got 18-hour operation, 7 days a week. You will use all that power on site and you will slash your electricity bill. If I get time, I'll come back to offsetting, because there's different rules about offset. You don't actually get an offset if you use the power on site, but you do if it's a building you own but don't occupy and don't pay the electricity bill. So that's like your commercial estate, that type of thing. Let's not forget car parks. They're coming through quite strongly now. You have a solar canopy over the car park. Again, a very similar sort of project. In fact, there's all sorts of other benefits you can get from car parks: increased lighting, security, better management of the site, and so on. Let's quickly move on to social housing. Social housing is completely different because we've got these things called tenants, and it's a highly regulated market. But what a lot of authorities don't realise is they say, oh, we've got no sites to build a solar farm. But if you've got 2,500 social houses, and you put 3 kilowatts of solar on each one, which is a fairly straightforward task, you've got 7.5 megawatts of capacity. So as big as a good commercial sized solar farm. Now, I did the first project in the country in 2012 with Wrexham County Borough Council in North Wales. We put 5 megawatts of solar on 3,000 council houses. And that scheme has been very, very profitable. It's probably talking out of school, but the FIT payment to Wrexham per annum every year for 25 years is £700,000 tax-free. That's because they did it right at the start of the financial incentives and got the highest level of FITs that are actually available. The scheme's now changed from giving the electricity to the tenants free, which that one did, to what you do with the power. But it is possible to do it now, and I'm very surprised that more schemes haven't come forward on social housing. There's still 2.5 million council houses in the UK owned by local authorities, and lots of projects possible there. Let's quickly look at the business cases and offsetting then. The business case is for member approval. We work up the scheme. We say, help them write a report, and they go to members and say, we've had somebody look at this who knows what they're doing. And effectively they said, yes, we have got a scheme. We do an industry standard financial model, which is an Excel spreadsheet. Here's exactly how much it's going to cost. Here's exactly how much it's going to make over the 25-year period. And that's where you get your IRR figure from. But the profitability of a scheme depends on where the electricity goes. And there's all sorts of different values on that. Now, I mentioned a moment or two ago, FITs, you probably remember that, the feed-in tariff or the renewable obligation, which were two different government incentives that paid you money for your solar panels or your wind turbine or whatever it was. So on the credit side of your transaction, you had the government incentive plus what you did with the power. On the debit side, you had the costs of actually building the asset itself. Of course, those have now gone, even though solar has just come back into CFDs, but I won't go there today. So effectively, you have to do it post-subsidy, and it all depends on what happens to the power. So I mentioned already in the leisure centre, if you use the power on site, you're paying 10 to 12 pence, so that's the value you will get from doing that regime, and it works very well as a business case on anywhere in the country. If you have to put your electricity into the grid, if it goes down the wholesale network, you get about 5 pence for it. If it's private wire, where you can just plug into a nearby off-taker who might want to take that power and use it on their site, you might get 8 to 10 pence for it. Sleeving is another opportunity, but there's no real financial benefit for that. But where all the private sector and the smart money is battery storage and electricity trading. It's called time shifting. So effectively, the electricity is generated during the day, it goes into the battery, but the battery is discharged into the grid at peak hours between 4:30 and 7, particularly in the winter. And that's when you get the premium rate. So you'll get the highest values in relation to that type of activity. Conclusions then, effectively, there's a lot of leading edge work going on around local government on this from authorities that I'm sure would be familiar to you. But essentially, you can only play in this space if you have some assets. So if you want to try and trade electricity or do some innovative way of trying to make your costs lower, you can only do it if you have the assets to do that. And so those authorities that have built solar farms or have got big building-based solar or wind turbines or whatever have certainly found that. And then you can seek out the best deals and react to market opportunities. But either way, it's better not to have an isolated project on its own, needs to be part of a strategy, a clear plan with proper reporting, and it is essential to understand how the electricity market works in order to make the most of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You made that sound easy, and I'm sure it's anything but. Finally handing over to James, who's going to talk to us about decarbonising regeneration and infrastructure. Thank you.
Right, hopefully you can all see that. So I had a few other slides on climate emergency, but I'll skip those because I think we've covered some of those points already. I just wanted to run through, I suppose, some of what I thought were options for local government and perhaps talk about one or two of those rather than all of them, because we could be here for hours talking about some of the complexities of delivering some of these projects. For my sins, I was a trainee in Steve's team back in the late 90s, so Steve and I know each other relatively well, and I've been working now with local government for the best part of about 25 years, delivering major infrastructure projects and regeneration projects. And throughout the time, because I've been working largely in the waste environment, we've been looking at how we deal with reduction of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in the waste sector. Largely, we're talking about methane, which has a shorter lifespan, but is obviously much worse than carbon dioxide in that sector. But at the same time, we're conscious of the need to deal with carbon dioxide emissions as well. These were my 10 options. The WRI provides 10 key solutions that they think are applicable for the public sector. However, not all of them are appropriate for local governments. So I've therefore had coming up with my own list. It's not an exhaustive list, and there are other options that might be available to some local authorities, CCS for new EFW facility or large EFW facility, for example, or potentially using biochar, for example, if we're talking about some of the local authority farms that have been mentioned so far. Other people have talked about specific areas. Steve's obviously touched quite heavily on investing in clean energy and efficiency, and Rachel's talked about some of the planning issues that apply in 3, 4 and 5, or are going to change in 3, 4 and 5. But I want to really focus on 3 specific areas: retrofitting buildings and some of the funding options, because at the end of the day, we are all operating in a very tight, constrained environment, and most local authorities don't have the money to do a lot of these activities, and unless they've got a significant expenditure they can offset associated with it. I'll talk a little bit about the changes to the procurement regime that are coming down the line. Obviously, there's new guidance that's been issued in the last couple of weeks, which is relevant, and also the sort of more fundamental changes that are coming as well to the procurement regime. And finally, I'll just talk on some sort of horizon scanning issues, sort of changes in law and strategy that we know are coming down the line and are going to have an impact on new and existing infrastructure. But as I noted earlier, the key thing is delivering all of these options, and usually comes or has a requirement for funding, and that's probably the thing that's most important for delivering these projects. I just wanted to touch on a few of the funding options. I'm concentrating here on regeneration and infrastructure, and there is clearly a wider number of funding streams available to local government in certain different scenarios. Transport and electric charging, for example, both have their own funding streams, and I haven't listed them here. To add to which, we don't have much time, so again, I'm going to just concentrate on a couple of these, the ones that are sort of most relevant really for the circumstances that we're talking about today. Salix Finance, or Phase 2 PSDS, for those who haven't come across it, is a bit similar to Phase 1. This is the public sector decarbonisation scheme. And the idea is to support the transition to low carbon heating in public sector buildings, in addition to improving carbon efficiency. And it does this by funding to replace end-of-life fossil fuel systems. So if you've got a gas boiler that's coming to the end of its life, then the Salix Finance may well provide a suitable option for funding a low carbon heat source. It can be in the form of a grant or loan. The loan is at preferential rates and based on specific options being made against the investment. It's similar to Phase 1, as I said, but the formula's changed slightly and the value is reduced from £500 to £350 per tonne equivalent of CO2 emissions over the lifetime of the project, that is. There's a long list of criteria for eligibility. So you've obviously got to have a fossil fuel heating system at the moment. It's got to be coming to the end of its life. And there's, perhaps importantly, there's a £5 million cap on the application that can be made. Doesn't stop you making multiple applications for different things. So you could have different buildings that have got different problems, and you could, seek investment up to 5 million for each of those assets. And another option, just moving on, is transforming construction. There's certainly when we're building new buildings, and we are now looking at the modernising construction agenda, looking at new processes and techniques, and there's again £170 million available from central government, which could be used to invest in new arrangements using digital design, standardising modular components, and potentially encouraging some off-site manufacture. The next one to probably talk about is HNIP. So this is the Heat Network Investment Project. Again, this is one of the key delivery objectives of the government. And they're providing around £320 million of government support. Now, I think they've done estimates, and they reckon that we need to have about 18% of UK heat come from heat networks by 2050 if we're to meet the carbon target cost effectively. So there's potential for quite significant development of heat networks, and there's still a couple of rounds left if anyone is interested in bidding for those. So the bid is managed separately by by a separate entity, but we can provide details on that if people need to get access to it. Then sort of the final one to just touch on is probably non-public investor. It's a term that might sometimes get used in the context of heat networks. It simply is the public sector matched funding or priority funding that might come associated with the delivery of those projects, depending on how they're delivered. I think the key message that I wanted to get across, and that whatever the scheme is, it will probably involve capital expenditure. And the good news is the government is willing to spend significant sums on what I would call the low-hanging fruit. In a lot of cases, that funding needs to be incurred by the end of the financial year, so there's not a lot of time to get on board with some of these things. The difficulty, or the less good news, is that the more transformative projects can take a bit more time to deliver. So if we start too late, we might not be able to achieve the goal of net zero by 2050. So just moving on to procurement, changes in procurement. Obviously, I suspect everybody's fairly familiar with the Green Paper on transforming public procurement, which was published shortly before Christmas. I mentioned that paper because in that document they made clear that they would seek to encourage authorities to find ways to achieve social value objectives. It also made clear that they were going to allow public bodies to propose allowing criteria that went beyond the subject matter of the contract. I think there's one of the questions has been raised already about that issue. And so they're looking to encourage suppliers to operate in a way that contributes to the economic, social and environmental outcomes as stated by the government. Now that's beyond what is currently permitted by Regulation 67, but we'll perhaps come back to that later in the questions. Importantly, the change is going to include a requirement to have regard to the new National Procurement Policy Statement. Now that was published on, I think it was the 4th of June. I was away at the time, but effectively the government has recognised that there's about £290 billion spent each year by the public sector, and that's a huge buying power, ability to be able to change the way that bodies involved with central and local government can deliver climate change and reduce waste. So one of the very specific items they cover is tackling climate change and reducing waste. So contributing to the UK's legally binding target to reduce GHG emissions to net zero by 2050, for example, reducing waste and improving resource efficiency and contributing towards moving towards a circular economy, and finally identifying and prioritising opportunities for sustainable procurement to deliver environmental benefits. So it's not there yet, but we fully anticipate that change to the public procurement regime will embed some of those obligations around the National Procurement Policy Statement in due course. And finally, on this slide, I just wanted to note PPN 0621. It doesn't apply to local authorities. They're not in scope, central government body and NDPBs and agencies only. But it may be that a similar approach is adopted by some local authorities for major procurements. And what PPN 0621 does is it requires bidders bidding to central government for contracts above 5 million to submit information about their approach to climate change, and it applies a pass-fail requirement within the new SQ. So bidding entities will have to demonstrate that they are both dealing with the upstream and downstream activities and are reporting appropriately on their carbon reduction plans in the procurement for major projects. The takeaway, I suppose, again from this one is that there's some fairly significant changes to the procurement regime which are likely to impact on the regeneration and on the delivery of regeneration and new infrastructure. And then finally, just a bit of horizon scanning, really. So I suspect those on the call will be aware of the Environment Bill, which is sat in the background. Not everybody will have read it. Certainly, it's quite lengthy and there's a lot in it now. When it was first introduced, it only had the first part, which was the environmental governance part. But following pressure, they've introduced the second provision, which includes improvement of the environment, including measures on waste and resource efficiency, air quality, environmental recall, water, nature, biodiversity, and conservation governance. It's become a bit of a beast, really, in that sense. There's already been a series of consultations on various aspects, including in part of the bill. There was recently the Environmental Principle Policy Statement, deposit return schemes, and extended producers' responsibility for packaging. There is currently a consultation taking place on the second consultation on consistency in household and business recycling, which is due to close on the 4th of July. And people may have seen that there's been some concern expressed already in the press about potentially leading to a 7-bin system for some residents. However, there are exceptions within the within the Act, and it's not quite clear how that's going to work, how the leeway is going to work, until we see the sort of detail of statutory guidance, which is going to come with it. What does appear to be coming, though, is a change to household food waste collection, separate from green waste, making the former a weekly collection from all households and potentially free fortnightly collection of green waste. So that's going to be a change for some authorities who currently charge for green waste, and it's also going to be a change for some authorities who don't necessarily have a separate food waste collection that they're operating at the moment. That probably means new or altered waste vehicles, changes to throughput of vehicles at facilities where that waste is being disposed of. And there may also be changes to built facilities that are already constructed for the purposes of managing both streams in a combined sense. So lots of IVCs, for example, take green waste and food waste at the same time. I am aware of one project in Wales where we did look at that specific issue, and whilst they collect them separately, they do remix them at the facility because the Welsh Government allowed that leeway for that particular authority. It sort of remains to be seen where we go with that in England. And I think there is an acceptance that there are going to be some complex and onerous contracts out there. And so one of the features of the consultation at the moment is providing evidence associated with the impact of those changes. Basically, I think the message there is get your evidence back into to government. Certainly, if you have a benefit from recovering income from green waste collections. Secondly, the Heat Networks Scotland's Act. This is intended to plug a hole in Scotland regarding licenses, consent, planning and powers. There are powers at the moment in section 170A and 170B of the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. But Scottish authorities don't have the same status as other statutory undertakers, water authorities or electricity companies. And this is arguably going to be fixed by the Act once it's fully brought into force. We have a similar position in England and Wales under section 11 and 12 of the Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act. And there are questions about permitted development and various other things that can be done in relation to the delivery of heat networks. And again, we are expecting at some point potentially to see some primary legislation dealing with that situation, but it hasn't been put on hasn't been drafted yet. There's a heat and building strategy that is due to come out any day soon. It was mentioned as coming out 6 months after the National Infrastructure Strategy, which was published in November last year. and reports will be published sometime during June 2021. I think Kwasi Kwarteng is supposed to be having a conversation with the Chancellor sometime soon to talk about that. And we also know the government's looking at building regulations and potentially tightening those. So it'd be interesting to see how far that goes and whether that potentially enables authorities to go back to looking at tightening building regulations. And finally, I just wanted to touch on emissions ceilings. So there's some changes to the FW facilities and the breath that are coming down the line in 2023, 24. And there's also some changes under the National Emissions Ceilings Regulations 2018 in respect of the levels of ammonia released from uncovered slurry and storage pits. The reason for mentioning it is in about 2025, many small farm holdings are going to have some modifications done to their assets in order to ensure that slurry pits are properly covered. So in those circumstances, there is going to be a need for us to deal with how those assets are managed going forward. And that's just taking back to the point on farms that was mentioned earlier by a couple of other people. So from a slightly different context, we're looking at the environmental impacts of those things. Takeaway from this, just before I finish, is lots of regulatory and legislative changes coming down the track, which are going to impact on regeneration and infrastructure.
Thank you so much, James. I think we can all acknowledge that every speaker has spoken with passion and commitment. It's a very exciting cutting-edge area of law, and one that'll have plenty of developments in the future. So all that remains for me to do at this moment in time is to thank profusely our experts for coming and agreeing to talk to us. Thank you for giving up your time to come and listen to. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you, panelists. Thank you.